it's time to chill out, time to lay back, time to be cool. Because we're going to be looking over the next half hour at one of the most important musicians of the 20th century, none other than the great Miles Davis. Now, I don't know if you are a follower or a fan of jazz music. It's one of those things, we know the sound of jazz, but for many people, they've never really engaged with it. They don't know the different styles. They don't know the history. So before we look at how Miles Davis transformed jazz, and he absolutely did, let's have a little bit of a potted history lesson of the art form itself. Now, jazz, well, it originated in New Orleans in the USA in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bearing in mind that what was going on there culturally at the time was a melting pot of cultures, including, of course, the music of African slaves, the American musical traditions, and indeed European musical traditions. What we saw was a kind of collaboration, a collocation of all these different sounds and styles, all in New Orleans. And the reason it took place here is that this is one of the places where black people were allowed to congregate and make music. In other places in the USA, that was not so allowed. So this was why New Orleans and then subsequently Chicago were the hubs, really, of the development of the art form. And here is an early recording from the very early 20th century. Now, what you can hear in there is a real mixture of instruments. You've got, obviously, an upright bass. You've got the banjo in there. You've got the clarinet. And this was what was known really as Dixieland jazz, but it evolved. And what we started to see is jazz becoming much more mainstream. Composers, of course, like George Gershwin would, as people would say, sort of smarten it up and take it into the concert hall. But what we started to see was that jazz became immensely popular in the form of big band jazz. And it's the 1920s that was considered kind of the golden age of the big band. It's where it became very, very popular in the USA and across Europe. Of course, this also went hand in hand with the development of recorded sound. People would often have record players. They would listen to these tracks on record. And so you started to see in the Roaring Twenties, alongside Prohibition and speakeasies and flappers, you started to see jazz music being driven into the mainstream. It was much more laid back. It encouraged dance. It was a much more vibrant and modern sound compared to the, frankly, rather staid and classical sounds that people were used to listening to. And this made overnight success stories of great characters and musicians that we still know today, like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington and Count Basie. And a big band, or as it's commonly known, a jazz orchestra, is a type of musical ensemble that brings together groups of musicians in sections. And just as with a classical orchestra, you have kind of families being lumped together. Now, in a classical orchestra, you'll have a string family, you'll have woodwinds, you'll have brass, you'll have percussion. In a jazz orchestra, in a big band, you'll have four sections generally. You'll have saxophones of different sizes. So you might have soprano saxes, altos, tenors, baritone saxes. You'll have trumpets. You'll have trombones, again, different sizes. And you'll have a rhythm section, usually a drum kit leading that, sometimes with more than that, though. And the big band sound is really kind of distinctive. Here's a little bit of big band. Now, I don't know about you, I can't hear music like this without my shoulders going. It's a combination of the swung rhythm with the use of syncopation. This is playing against the beat, which drives the music forwards and makes your shoulders go, makes your toes tap, makes you want to dance. And so you can see why this very upbeat, very cheerful style, big band jazz, was so popular and dominated really popular music for decades. It originated during the early 1910s and dominated, as I say, up well into the 1940s when swing was at its height, and a considerable range of styles evolved within big band jazz. Many of the better known bands very much reflected the popularity and the individuality of the band leader. So, for example, Count Basie's band, they played a kind of relaxed, kind of propulsive swing. You had band leaders like Bob Crosby, and you might think I recognize that surname. He was indeed the brother of Bing, and that had more of a Dixieland style. So you had more clarinets and that sort of slightly less laid back feel, slightly pushing forwards there. Benny Goodman had a hard driving style, and Duke Ellington's compositions were varied and very sophisticated. In fact, his Sacred Concert is an incredible piece. I would thoroughly recommend. If you haven't heard it, it is absolutely outstanding. But that all brings us to this man here. The reason we are all meeting today to enjoy this deep dive. This, everyone, is Miles Davis. Now, he was obviously a trumpeter, and you'll know that from any image you see of Miles Davis. He's got a trumpet in his hand for the most part. He studied at the Juilliard School in New York City and made his debut as a member of Charlie Parker's bebop quintet. Now, you'll have heard the word bebop, and I'm just going to press... I've got a button here with bebop written on it. And this is kind of a little example of what bebop sounds like. Here we go. Now, if I had to ask you to describe this sound, I think we'd all immediately say fast. You'd say complicated, difficult, furious, moving quickly. These are all definitions of bebop. And Miles Davis was an extraordinary bebop artist. Charlie Parker, otherwise known as Bird, he was one of the pioneers of the bebop style. And this was a popular, but kind of still at the same time, kind of a niche style of jazz in the late 1940s going into the 1950s. The real issue that I have with bebop, and indeed I think a lot of people have, is it's not very relaxing to listen to. It's not very easy to listen to. It's very propulsive. It moves forwards. It makes you feel kind of jittery, and it's not very mainstream. And this often happens, in fact, with musical styles when they first develop. The early proponents of the style produce kind of the defining versions of that music, but they're often quite simple. And as the style evolves, more and more musicians come along and they develop the style to the point that it cannot get any more complicated. At that point, it needs to reset. If you consider Baroque music, of course, the end of the Baroque era, you've got Bach and his musical offering and the art of fugue, which are about as complicated as the style could get before it then needed to reset into the classical era. If you look at rock and roll in the 1950s and how that developed into prog rock in the 1970s with bands such as Yes and Genesis, to the kind of sound that is amazing and overwhelming and complicated, of course, that would then need to be reset in the 1980s. So bebop was kind of one of those moments. Very, very complicated, very, very fast, very complex. And you would describe it as a hot sound. Okay, you can have hot jazz and you can have cold jazz. Now, bebop is fast, as we've said. It's loud, it's heavy, it's angular. Okay, the shapes of the musical phrases are kind of spiky. They jump around. It's high-pitched, it's high energy, it's very, very dense. And Charlie Parker, as seen here, he was one of the real key leaders of this art form. It emerged in the 40s. It was popular, as I say, in New Orleans and Chicago, but it requires immense skill and technique. It's actually really quite hard to get your head around it. Now, what you find in bebop is these very virtuosic lines. You've got to be an incredible player on your instrument. You need to know all your scales. You need to be able to throw yourself around in these patterns in a very secure way over a series of chords. Now, in jazz, these are known as the changes, okay? The chords that go underneath the line. And what we find with bebop is that these changes are built on kind of diatonic harmony, on straightforward chords. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but it was these chords and the fact that it was so virtuosic, so hard to listen to, this is what prompted Miles Davis to start experimenting with something new. Now, we can have hot jazz, as we've just heard. You can have cold jazz, but cool jazz is something different. It's something in between. It's a smoother sound. And it was Miles Davis who was the main proponent of this style. It's where bebop is fast and angular. Well, cool jazz is slow. It's softer, it's lighter, it's low pitched, it's lower energy, it's much more sparse. And Miles Davis, in his album Birth of the Cool, well, he came up with a different style of playing. Much slower, much more in the middle register of his instrument. And playing cool is very much about as much how you play as what you play. So Birth of the Cool is one of the most important albums of the 1950s because it just encouraged everyone to chill out, cool down, papa, don't you blow your top, as the song goes. And so it's less intense, it's less aggressive, it's slower, it's quieter, it's in the middle, and it very much defined a sound but also a way of being. Now, of course, during the 1950s, one of the things that Miles Davis did with his trumpet was he started using something called a Harmon mute, and you can see it shown here. This basically stops some of the sound coming out of the trumpet. And previously, it wasn't really used as a soloing instrument. It was made to soften the sound of brass instruments to let a vocalist or another instrument come through. But Miles Davis made this part of the cool sound and part of the character of his playing. It allowed him to talk through his instrument. It became really part of his signature sound for the rest of his career. So in 1949 and in 1950, Miles Davis assembled this group of musicians to lay down the so-called Birth of the Cool recordings. And the Birth of the Cool was really innovative because, well, for one thing, it was put together by a larger group. One of the things about bebop is you generally only have 4 or 5 musicians in a bebop quintet. But Birth of the Cool was recorded by a nonet. So this had 9 musicians, a larger ensemble that was usual or even possible in bebop. It was very influenced by classical music in its forms and its arrangements. It didn't just rely on straightforward blues forms, which are usually what we would call A, where you have a pattern, you repeat it, you change it, and then you bring the original pattern back. It was very influenced by chamber music in its sound because it was trying to do something different to bebop, which is all about that fast, furious, virtuosic tonality and texture. And rather than playing the head chorus in bebop, and in unison, which I'll explain a bit more. In fact, here's an example. This is a bit of Charlie Parker from 1952. And just have a little listen. There's an introduction. So this is bebop. So this is the head chorus. That pattern played all together. So that is a typical head chorus. It's called the head because it's at the start. And in order to go back to the head, you tap your head to show the rest of the musicians you're going back there. Now what follows is fast improvisation over a 12-bar blues pattern. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with these terms, improvisation just means you're making it up, but you're not making it up completely freely, just willy-nilly. That would come later with the music of Ornette Coleman. Now, what you have with improvisation is you have these changes, you have these chords. And I mentioned the 12-bar blues, which is basically 12 measures where you have a straightforward pattern, which everyone knows, based on 3 chords. So you'll have and then that pattern repeats. And over the top of that, you have improvisation. Now, it's a great way of building up an exciting piece, but of course, at this point, jazz is not a new art form. Everyone had heard it all before. And this started to feel really restrictive on the musicians of the age, none more so than Miles Davis. There were also some amazing musicians going on at the same time, like Dave Brubeck, of course. You had Charles Mingus, all of these producing incredible albums around this time. But in 1959, Miles Davis changed the sound of jazz forever. He put together an incredible band consisting of himself, obviously on trumpet, Paul Chambers on bass, Jimmy Cobb on the drums, the great Bill Evans on piano, and more on him in a minute, and two superstars on saxophone. You had Julian Cannonball Adderley on the alto sax, and the one and only John Coltrane on tenor sax. This is kind of a super group. This really is. These are the absolute best of the best, all playing together. And this was to be one of the most important albums in the history of jazz because of its use of something called modal jazz. Now, modal jazz was born to solve a problem, which we've already mentioned today, which is that with bebop and even cool jazz, all the styles that followed bebop, there are only so many different chord progressions that you can make using straightforward diatonic harmony, where you have major chords and minor chords, and it had all been done, it had all been heard, and you can only improvise a certain way using these straightforward chord patterns. And of course, what musicians want to do always is to try and find new sounds. And so Miles Davis, via his pianist Bill Evans, became familiar with the work of George Russell. Now, this particular tome, bit of light reading if you want to go and buy it, is called The Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization. Boże moi, it really is. It's not light reading. But this chap here, George Russell, he believed that the dominant function in jazz is the driving force behind all harmonic motion, the feeling of dominant chords, dominant melody moving forwards. So he started focusing on what was called the Lydian mode. Now, modes, in short, are patterns of notes originally discovered and written about and used by the ancient Greeks. In short, if you sit at a keyboard and you play the white notes between C and C, you get a major scale, but it's a mode. If you start on D and play all the white notes, you get a scale where it doesn't sound major or minor. It's a different shape. That's the Dorian mode. Okay, then we have the Phrygian mode, and if you start on F, you get the Lydian mode. And it's basically the same shape as a major scale, except the fourth is raised. If I play what's on screen here, you can hear it sound sort of super major because of that F sharp, which is why Danny Elfman uses it for The Simpsons. So the Lydian mode is interesting because if you pull the scale apart, what you get is a whole load of fifths. So if I go from C to G, it's a fifth, and then to a D, and then an A, and an E, and a B, and an F sharp. And then if you stack those, you get this chord, which is C major 13 with a sharpened 11th. And that is a really, really interesting chord. This is a different sound to the traditional sounds of bebop and big band jazz. What this gives the musicians is more colours to paint with, more sounds to make. And if you compare that with a tonal sound, this is much more traditional, this is much more sort of bebop and big band. That is your traditional blues scale. We've all heard that sound before. And the chords underneath have a kind of movement to them. You can hear where it's going. And you can improvise over the top of that. Using the traditional structures. Now, let's compare that to a modal set of notes. And what you find with modal chords is instead of using these structures that we used to, is they space them out. So if we look at this chord here, we've got F, B, E, and A. Now, you've all heard that before. You've all heard that sound. But it's not major, it's not minor. It's cool. And what this gives you is much more freedom, much more flexibility, a different kind of sound. It does create a suspended sort of vibe. It's simplified. It allows the musicians like Miles Davis to focus much more on the creative side and have far fewer restrictions, because you're not having to fit to chords. Instead, you're using these scales over much more empty space. Consider if you were trying to plant in a garden and you were having to fit round all of the plants that were already there, you only have a limited amount of space to plant your crop. Whereas if you have a completely open field, you can lay it out any way you like. So let's return to Kind of Blue, because this was one of the first albums to utilize this particular style, modal jazz. It was recorded in 1959 in 2 sessions. On March the 2nd, 1959, where they recorded the A-side, which consisted of Freddie Freeloader, Blue and Green, and So What, which we'll be looking at in a minute. And on April the 22nd, they came back and they recorded all blues and the flamenco sketches, which is going to be a really important track later on. Now, this was fairly typical for Miles Davis. There was almost no rehearsal involved. The musicians had very little idea as to what they were going to record on that day. They just turned up. Miles Davis told them what they were going to do. They literally just sort of had to play around, and then they hit record. Miles Davis believed, as many musicians did at the time, in first thought is best thought. Rather than slavishly practicing and getting all these lines absolutely perfect, it was what comes out, comes out. And really, that comes across in A Kind of Blue, because so many of the tracks were single takes, no rehearsals, no cuts, just one take, done. And you consider, when you listen to this album, just how complicated, just how amazingly well this flows. This does show the quality of these musicians. Now, once the musicians were there, they were recording, and they came up with this first track, the heart of the album, which is called So What. And you've heard this. This is an iconic track in the world of modal jazz. And even before you press play, but even before you listen to So What, there's a world of meaning in that title, isn't there? If you consider what cool jazz and modal jazz in particular were trying to say to the world, it's got a kind of hostility to it. So what? If you think about so much of the movie making, so much of the rebellion going on, what have you got? Easy Rider. There's a huge amount of cool, laid back. So, the world can go and do what it wants to do. I'm just going to sit here with my sunglasses on. And it's no accident that Miles Davis, after this particular era of his life, would go on to define so many other forms of music, including rap at the end of his life, because he was, at the end of the day, a rebel. Let's have a little listen to the opening of So What, and then we're going to dive into what makes this piece so special. Here we go.
Part 1, the music written by Miles Davis, he calls So What.
And what's it saying? So what? So what? So this is the head chorus. And notice they're not in unison. They are moving together, but they're playing chords. Now, improvisation coming very soon. But the chords are not moving as you would expect. Okay, here goes Miles. And this line is lower and slower and feels emptier and fuller at the same time. Now, this is a live performance. The album, of course, has a different improvisation. The improvisation is different every time. Of course, the head chorus is the same. So let's just explore a little bit of this iconic So What theme, because I'm pretty sure everyone out there has heard this particular track, at least the opening of it. And what's fabulous about this is it does have a chord And in case you're wondering, this piano, by the way, is called the Kind of Blue Steinway because they sequenced for this particular set of sounds, they sequenced the very same piano used on this album. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. So now we've got a G major chord here. We've got a D, a G, and a B. Underneath that, you've got 2/4. So you've got that sparse sound with the warmth of the chords on top. Ba-dum, 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 bum. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Dum, 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 dum. Yeah, and the so what is kind of punctuating. Interestingly, the chords, or the chord at the start of that is built on these notes, on E, A, D, G, and B. The 5 bottom strings of a guitar. I don't think that is by accident. And so that particular pattern plays around twice, and then this is the modal bit. This is the interesting bit. What happens is that pattern shifts up a semitone. So instead of going, oh, excuse me there, ba-dum, 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 then it shifts up, ba-dum, 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 bum, dum, 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 and then it shifts down again, and this is a complete departure from what had gone before. No more of this chord 1, chord 4, chord 5. This was a new sound and a new direction. And I used to do this when I was a music teacher. What I'm going to do, and I'm going to leave this for you to have a go if you wish. I've recorded this in to my sequencer here, and if you have a listen, we've got the bass and we've got the drums as well. So this is the opening pattern, and if you have an instrument that can play these notes, so for example a keyboard, a piano, if you just play any of the white notes in between D and D, I'm just going to just stop the track for now. You play any of these notes, any of those white notes in any order, try and lean a bit more on D, because that's the home note, then that will fit with 3/4 of these changes. If you then want to shift up to the black notes, E flat, G flat, A flat, B flat, D flat, just the black notes, that will fit as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make up an improvisation to the so what changes. I'm going to keep it as simple as I can, because it's not bebop, it's cool, and it's modal. Here we go. Now we're going to move to the black notes here. And back down to the white notes. And you can see the fun you can have with this relatively simple pattern, but it's so different from the jazz that had gone before. It really did change the world of this particular style. Now, Miles Davis wasn't done. He would go on to record some incredible albums. This is ESP. It's from 1965. This was a new group, a new quintet. And the saxophonist, a guy called Wayne Shorter, he contributed a track to this called ESP, but it was basically inspired by the idea that this group was so good that they seemed to communicate by mental telepathy. They didn't need to talk, they would just play. Agata from 1975 was a live album. This starts to incorporate African and funk rhythms. So Miles Davis is constantly reinventing himself and reinventing music. This one, I have to say, alongside Kind of Blue, which I want you all to listen to and enjoy, listen to Sketches of Spain as well. Produced just the year after Kind of Blue, and very much inspired by the Flamenco Sketches track from Kind of Blue. This contains almost half the record is taken up with a jazz version of the Concerto de Aranjuez, the guitar concerto by Rodrigo. It is exquisite. It's so, so good. And it uses elements of modal jazz mixed in with the Spanish sound. It is incredible and well worth listening to. Now, of course, in the 1970s, there he is. Miles Davis moved away from traditional jazz into kind of jazz fusion and came up with albums like On the Corner and Bitches Brew, which is a groundbreaking album, controversial amongst jazz purists. He collaborated with musicians like Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea and influenced fusion and funk artists. In 1975, he retired abruptly, suffering from health issues and depression, but then came back in the 1980s with an album called The Man with the Horn. And then in the 1980s, he embraced synthesizers. I mean, what a career this man had. He worked with bands like Toto, collaborated with Prince, and even managed to put on concerts in the 90s alongside Quincy Jones, revisiting his earlier work. He was incredible. He inspired so many musicians. We're still unpicking Miles Davis's influence to this day. He was an extraordinary musician whose sound and influence shaped the sound of the 20th century and beyond. I cannot recommend his work highly enough to you. Start with Kind of Blue, listen to Sketches of Spain, and then enjoy, because his music is well worth the work. So everyone, if you've enjoyed this, do please consider looking at some of our other deep dives. There are nearly 50 of them on the Home Choir channel, covering all sorts of different subjects, from classical music to film music too, as you've heard today, jazz. And if you have enjoyed this, do please remember to subscribe to the channel. Do give us a thumbs up if you're here watching live. Do leave us a comment underneath if you're watching later. And do feel free to send it to someone who you think could do with a smile and certainly a bit of cool music. So we'll look